Star City. Thou art my hiding place. Thou shalt preserve me from trouble. Thou shalt compass me about with songs of deliverance. Selah. Psalm 32:7, King James Version. My son Evan James Seals was born on September 15, 2008 in Franklin, Tennessee. We gave him the same middle name as my dad's name, James. I like the name Evan because it rhymes with heaven. God had given us a healthy, beautiful boy. For months leading up to his birth, we were very worried though. Lisa and I had waited late in life to have a baby, and we knew the older Lisa was, the more dangerous it was for Evan's health. We trusted that God would handle it though, and we put it in his hands. The doctors at Vanderbilt told us that he may be born with Down syndrome. We had several ultrasounds done to check our little boy's progress. One particular procedure made us very anxious. It's called amniocentesis. It's where a sample of the amniotic fluid surrounding the fetus is withdrawn through a needle inserted into the mother's uterus. Thankfully, the test came back negative. After getting the news he was all right, Lisa and I sat in the car at the doctor's office and cried for 30 minutes. We were so relieved that he wasn't harmed during the test. We thank God for answering our prayers. To this day, I've never taken Evan's presence on this earth for granted. He's been God's greatest gift and my proudest accomplishment. Evan was born at the Williamson County Hospital in Franklin. Lisa had to have a cesarean section because Evan's umbilical cord was wrapped around his upper body. The procedure went perfectly, though. Lisa's doctor, Kim Scott, handed him to the nurse, and she brought him over to a heated table. That was the first time I was able to get a close look at him. He was crying, but when I said, "Hey, Evan, it's your dad," he became still and looked towards me. It was unforgettable. We brought him back to the house after several days. I spent the next few months at home with Lisa and Evan. I couldn't believe I was now a dad. I realized what that meant pretty quickly, though, having to get up and down through the night to make sure he wasn't suffocating under a blanket or something. Lisa seemed to love her new role as a mother, and she was wonderful with him. When things settled down a little bit, we were able to travel to Ohio and Mississippi so the rest of the family could see our son. Mom was so excited, and so was Aunt Tootie. They treated him like a newborn king. It was good to see Mom happy again. It had been a very rough and lonely year for her without Dad. I knew I needed to get back to work to pay for the bills that were racking up. Hot Apple Pie tried to reinvent ourselves over and over, but it just didn't work. Trey had gotten to the point of wanting to go back to Louisiana, and we couldn't blame him. We even tried to get Stan Lynch to come in and jam with me, Kevin Ray, and Keith Horn to see if there might be some magic. It sounded great, but Stan said he didn't know if he had time to tour. He loved the idea of making a record, though. We finally came to the realization we had run our course as a band. We only had a few shows booked that we were obligated to play. After those dates, we decided to go our separate ways as friends. We gave it our all, but for some reason God didn't want us to move forward with it. I can say with certainty that God was watching out for me during Dad's crossover. It would have been extremely difficult to go through all of that with tour dates looming over my head. I would have had to cancel several months of shows and would have possibly been sued because of it. Dad had asked me in the hospital room to keep on making music, so I did. I was back into the routine of writing and recording. Stan and I had become good friends, and he also urged me to keep doing what I was doing and said that somehow down the line it'd pay off. My friend Joe Chambers invited me down to see a new project that he had been working on called the Musicians Hall of Fame Museum. I knew Joe because he owned Chambers guitars. He had 3 guitar stores scattered around the area, and I did some part-time work with him back in 2003 at his Cool Springs store in Franklin. It was 5 minutes from my house, and it was therapeutic for me to just clock in and do my job. Most of the time it was just me and Ryan Warner, Steve Warner's son, sitting around playing music and talking about rock and roll. I cleaned instruments, checked people out at the cash register, and helped sell guitars to Joe's customers. While working at the Cool Springs store, Joe shared his vision of starting the museum. It took him years to make it happen, but he did. He and his wife Linda worked feverishly to find a building, do all the renovations, and then track down all kinds of historical items to showcase to visitors. I was thoroughly impressed when I was finally able to walk through the museum. They did an incredible job. The place looked fabulous. While on tour, Joe showed me another large area that was going to be for guitar teachers to come in and give lessons to students. Immediately, I thought it'd be a great spot for me to have a small studio and a place to work and write. I knew I needed a place other than the house since Evan had arrived. I didn't want to disturb him and Lisa. Joe loved the idea, and we worked out a lease agreement, and I moved in within a week, and I set up my gear. I spent the majority of my time at my studio space writing and recording. But I also had time to play a few shows with two artist friends of mine, Aaron Benward of the country duo Blue County and Brian McComas. We played some festivals using the same band and played the hits that we all had. We formed a little alliance and started to get a few shows as a trio. I was also working with some other friends of mine, Brian and Nancy Eckert. They were helping me manage my career. I was producing other acts and working on my own projects, so having them in my corner really helped with everything I was doing. I just loved them as people. They were sincere and honest. Nancy was an incredible music attorney, and Brian was a great bass player and writer. They also owned a little studio in Germantown called Verge Recording. When I talked about cutting demos, they introduced me to their in-house studio engineer, Greg Strezik. I could tell he knew what he was doing after we chatted that day. I had him mix a few tracks and was floored by what he did. I knew we'd go on to become longtime friends and work together in the future. One day, while standing in line at the movies, Lisa struck up a conversation with a stepfather and daughter waiting behind her. They got onto the subject of music somehow. They told Lisa that the girl was a singer and was trying to jumpstart her career. Lisa told them about me, Nancy, and Brian and how I was a producer and the team could possibly help. We met up weeks later and I heard her sing and felt like she could really do something in the biz. Her name was Amy Zimmerman, but she wanted to go by Nikki Z. She was a pretty girl, too, and seemed to have it all together for a teenager. We gathered some songs for her. Some were mine, and others I collected from publisher friends. We recorded a few songs with some of the guys that would go on to become Jason Aldean's band. The project fizzled out months later because Amy told us she was moving to L.A. to be with her real dad. It cost Nancy, Brian, and me a lot of time and effort. We had just lined up a meeting with Scott Hendricks at Warner Brothers for him to hear her. Scott was impressed and requested a showcase. Unfortunately, we had to tell him about the situation that had arisen. It had put a bad taste in my mouth about producing, but undeterred I told myself it was probably just a one-off thing. Around that same time, I met with a guy named David Bradley. He had been looking for a producer and someone to mentor him through the maze of madness of Nashville. Not only would I go on to produce his record, but I also helped him prepare for playing live and doing interviews. Lisa and I invited him over to the house to teach him a few tricks of the trade when he was on camera. David came from England and was a huge country fan. He had a strong voice, a good look, and I thought he had a great story. I devoted the next several months to producing his record, and to this day I think it turned out to be a great sounding CD. I worked on a few other projects as well. One was a Canadian artist named Larry Barrio. I co-produced that CD with Gil Grand, another northerner. The other artist was a kid from Westchester, Ohio, named Coy Taylor. I enjoyed the process of working in the studio and being around great musicians and engineers. While all of this was going on, I recorded some demos of my own with my friends and fellow musicians Buddy and Jim Hyatt. They had a crew of stellar players that would charge a flat rate to record the main tracks for demos for songwriters in Nashville. I planned to record as many songs as I could afford so I could begin looking for a new publishing deal. Somewhere in the middle of all of this activity, I talked with Tracy Brown, the head of an independent radio promotion company called CO5. I figured I could possibly work for them as a radio rep. I needed to bring in some money, and getting into the record business side of things sounded fun. In our conversation, she told me about a small independent record company called Star City Recording. She suggested that I talk to them to see if they'd be interested in signing me as a recording artist. She said she'd give them a call for me. I was so appreciative, but I was really hoping she'd give me a job. Some days later, I received a call from a guy named Jeff Glixman, head of Star City Recording. Tracy had called Jeff and shared my info and story with him. He asked if I'd send him some songs, and of course I agreed. I'd eventually find out that Jeff was the guy who produced Kansas back in the day. He also produced rock acts such as Gary Moore, Yngwie Malmsteen, the Georgia Satellites, and Black Sabbath. I was a huge fan of Kansas and the Georgia Satellites and thought that this might be a perfect musical fit. I can't remember how I sent my songs to him, either through mail or email. I had been used to sending people my songs and never hearing back. Nashville was notorious for doing that, but this time it was different. Jeff called me immediately and was extremely interested. He said he'd like to fly to Nashville to meet me, and he was bringing Phil Ehart, the drummer for Kansas, with him. He said if we can make this happen, Phil would be my manager. I couldn't believe it all happened so quickly. The next thing I knew, I was meeting at a J. Alexander's restaurant in downtown Nashville to talk about signing a record deal. Jeff and Phil were super nice and very excited about the possibility of me being on the label. After the meeting and some small talk, Jeff asked me, "How can we make your dreams come true?" Boy, that was a loaded question. I told him that I'd like to release some songs to radio again and make a good living to support my family. He didn't bat an eye. He said he loved what he heard and wanted to get the ball rolling. He explained that Star City was a small company out of Pennsylvania. They were based out of a studio there called Star City Recording Company, and they had an investor that was ready to lay some big money down on a few new select artists. He went on to say that their company was all about being creative and letting the artist be an artist. He didn't want to change a thing about me. I told Lisa when I got home from the meeting that it went as well as a meeting could go. We were both thankful that things were getting ready to take off again. I called Brian and Nancy and told them about the meeting. I also had to tell Aaron and Brian that I needed to back off from pursuing more road gigs with them. They were all very happy for me and knew this might be a really good opportunity. Since we all had been working a little bit together, I wanted them to understand what had been offered to me and get their blessing. They were all for it. After the shock wore off, I got to work. I wanted to make sure that I had some great songs for the CD. I had been writing with some great writers like Stan Lynch, my cousin TJ, Bobby Terry, Greg Freya, David Bradley, and Richard Marx. The whole CD was supposed to be fun and upbeat. I co-wrote one song with David Bradley and Greg Freya, Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, at my house with Evan sitting in his baby carrier. I guess you could say he was a co-writer. I had also been writing with an old DJ friend from Cincinnati, Bill White. He and I got together one day and wrote a song called Been There, Drunk That. It was a fun, up-tempo song that I thought would be a perfect fit for the CD. After writing it, I knew the CD was complete. Even though I was not a drinker, I had been around plenty in my line of work to know every little thing about it. When Jeff heard the song, he loved it. He felt it should be a single. We planned a video and began preparations to go on the road. Star City hired 9 North Records to be our radio promotion team. I had reservations about it, simply because I had been talking with CO5 and Tracy was responsible for putting us all together in the first place. In the end, there wasn't much I could do about it, except give my opinion. The label had already made their decision. I felt terrible telling Tracy and my old friend David Newmark, who worked at CO5, that Star City had chosen to use another team. The first single they released was a funny little song that TJ and I wrote called Hoedown. It didn't get any traction whatsoever with radio, and that was probably due to the lyrics. It was about a bar tramp that gets punched and knocked down on the dance floor by a jealous wife. We followed it up with Been There, Drunk That. We made a cool video and released it to radio. Nothing. It didn't even chart. The radio promotion team did not deliver on their promises. I was very disappointed in their company. I believe to this day that Star City wasted money hiring them. Here's how it works. A record label, investor, or an individual pays 9 North a sum of money to promote their song or songs to radio. 9 North tells the artist and their team that they can't guarantee anything, but they'll try their best to get the song or songs played. They in turn are supposed to call radio stations around the country and let the stations know they represent the artist in question and would ask the stations to consider playing the new single. The fee that the label, investor, or individual puts down also pays for flying the artist and the independent promotion guy or girl around the country to visit radio stations. Sometimes you play a few songs to the staff, sometimes you do an on-air interview, or sometimes you do a free show for the station. It's called a listener appreciation show. 9 North only had a handful of stations that would have independent artists like myself come in to talk about their projects. Most stations only play major label artists. So even though it seemed at the time that I was busy promoting the new single, there were only a few stations playing it in light rotation. I can't speak about any other genre of music but country, but independent radio promotion rarely works. I toured the country playing shows and had a blast doing it. I had a few other artists opening for me. The English artist I produced, David Bradley, and another label mate, Nathan Lee Jackson. Nathan brought his guitarist Keith Ridenauer to accompany him. My band and crew were made up of some great people and stellar musicians. Not only did we play some cool venues and meet some great people, but we were able to play tourists and visit some wonderful places. We visited Mount Rushmore and the Grand Canyon. We hiked mountains in Park City, Utah, and in Bozeman, Montana. I remember climbing a mountain with Steve Cochran, John Peepers Calzavera, and David Bradley on my 40th birthday. Then one day, Jeff Glicksman called to tell me that the label was in trouble financially. Jim Gentile was our main investor, and evidently he was taking a beating in the stock market. The Great Recession of 2008 was draining his accounts dry. Jeff told me everything needed to be suspended until further notice. It didn't take very long until we realized that Jim was almost broke. It was now 2009, and the dream had become a nightmare. The label was having to close down because of the lack of funding. There was really nothing I could do about it but start looking for another job. I wasn't too heartbroken over losing the record deal. I had been through it before. I knew that God had a plan. I just prayed for God's will to be done because I knew that He knew best. Jeff called me to apologize, as did Phil. They were both very disappointed that we wouldn't be able to continue to make music together. We were all in the same boat and it was sinking. We promised to stay in touch and went our separate ways. Several years later, in 2011, Jeff and I worked on another small project with Christine and Dave Boyd for Victory Cruise Lines down in Florida. Bill White and I wrote their theme song, and Victory used it for a TV commercial. Spanky, my friend and guitarist, traveled to Florida for a day and filmed it. That was the last real musical project that I was involved in with Jeff. Several major events happened in 2010. First, the album I produced for David Bradley was released. It featured Rodney Crowell on his breakout single and video Hard Time Moving On, written by Rivers Rutherford. It was truly a great song and a heartfelt performance. Sadly, it didn't do much because it was an independent release. David ran into the same issues that I did at country radio. Independent country artists have an exceptionally tough time trying to get airplay. That was also the year that I had $55,000 worth of music gear ruined in the Nashville flood. On May 1st and 2nd of that year, torrential rains belted Tennessee, Kentucky, and Mississippi. More than 13 inches of rain caused the Cumberland River to rise 52 feet and spill over into Nashville and the surrounding areas. The Red Cross put the death toll at 24, and property damage was virtually incalculable. I remember it raining on the first day like it was pouring out of a bucket. Local news warned people to stay at home because of flash floods. They also projected that the Cumberland River might overflow. Of course, I didn't listen to the warnings. I remember getting in my truck and taking a drive towards Franklin to see just how bad it was. I needed to check because the next day the band and I were supposed to leave on the bus to head west to play a series of shows. All of my gear and some of the band's equipment was stored at a place downtown called Soundcheck, located on the lip of the Cumberland River. Soundcheck was the largest music rehearsal, instrument rental, cartage, and storage facility in the Southeast. I headed down Franklin Road but didn't get far. I remember seeing the backside of Harlansdale Farm flooded by the Harpeth River. I couldn't believe my eyes. I had to turn around because the police had blocked the road. When I got home, I called our road manager, Steve, to ask if he'd heard anything. I asked him if we should go get our gear before the conditions got any worse. He said that it was already too late. His friend Ivan was freaking out too. Ivan had tried to drive into Nashville to get his PA that was stored at Soundcheck and wasn't able to because the road had been shut down. All I could do was wait. Steve was frantic trying to find a bus that was south of town to come and get us. The bus companies north of town wouldn't be able to. I called all the band members and told them the situation. I told them that they'd have to find some backup gear for the trip because getting our gear at soundcheck was not an option. Somehow we managed to scrounge up enough equipment to make the trip happen, but everyone was very worried. Luckily, I lived on a hill and knew that Lisa and Evan would be safe, so we headed out and hoped for the best. In the following days, we heard about the destruction. Soundcheck took the biggest punch of the flood. Equipment owned by tenants such as Keith Urban, Vince Gill, and Brad Paisley were ruined, along with equipment and instruments belonging to scores of Nashville's rank-and-file musicians. Damages reached well into the millions of dollars. After hearing the horror stories of people losing their lives and homes, I couldn't complain too much. Even though I had lost a lot, at least I still had my house and family. One of my crew members, Chris Tweedy, almost lost his life. His home was ruined in the flood. Rescue boats barely got him and his family out alive. About a month after the flood, we were able to go get our gear. Most of it had to be thrown away. Only a few things were salvageable. To this day, I'm thankful that I had insurance that covered about $22,000 of my losses. Also, a local organization, Music Cares, was generous enough to write everyone involved with the catastrophe a check for $1,000. God bless them. Fear not. It was a furious squall. The waves broke over the boat, threatening to capsize it. The men on the boat thought they were going to drown, and they were moments from going down. Jesus slept, with no worries in the world. The crew panicked, thinking all hope was lost. Jesus got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." The wind died down and was soon completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him?" I always loved that Bible story when I was a kid. You can read it for yourself in Mark 4:34 through 41. I think you'll come to the same conclusion as me. There's always hope when you have Jesus. I have almost lost hope several times trying to make a living playing music. I had pretty much given up thoughts of being a recording artist before Star City came along. I thought my glory days had come and gone. The music business is unpredictable and turbulent. Like Jesus' disciples, I pushed the panic button a time or two when things got rough. I didn't have enough faith in him to weather the storms. If I would have only known that there was a blessing on the horizon, a record deal, maybe I could have slept peacefully on the boat like my Savior did. Where you find hopelessness, you'll often find fear. Fear can sometimes immobilize you and make you want to give up. There are discrepancies as to how many times God mentions "fear not," or "don't be afraid," or "I will fear no evil" in the Bible. I don't know the exact amount, but I do know he says it a lot. He's adamant about telling us not to fear and never lose hope. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." Psalms 23:4, King James Version. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. Psalm 46:1-3, NIV. Fear does not come from God. It comes from Satan. For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power, and of love, and of a sound mind. 2 Timothy 1:7, King James Version. Don't let Satan rule your life and determine what you can and cannot do. Fight him with all your might and with God's word, and let him know who's boss. Have faith that Jesus will not desert you. Wait out the wind and rain and know that there will be a bright, shining sun that will be breaking through the clouds sometime soon.